I know you write across multiple eras. This is a Regency, but you also have some Victorians and you have some Highlander stories. So can you talk about more generally, how do stories come to you and how do you maybe decide, or are you just told through your muse
Yeah.
what a book should be?
Yeah, I write like most of my books, most of them are Regency. Like if I, looked across most of the series, the first book I ever wrote was actually the first book. It wasn't the first book I released, but the first book I ever wrote was the one, it's called Callum's Vow, and it's the Victorian Highlander series. So at that point in time, I had read a lot of Regency in different genres, but I didn't realize that most of the books that were read were within like certain genres. So I just wrote what I felt like writing in the era that just sort of came to me. And so it's like the name Victorian Highlanders. So it's like late Victorian, like 1880s. And part of that series takes place in Scotland, but a large part of it takes place in what is now like where I live in the middle of Canada. And that's kind of why I wrote that story, because I knew um, a lot of the history and the area. And really, that's just was a period that I thought, oh, this would be fun to write, and did a lot of research. And then there wasn't much of a market for that particular time and period because I didn't write it like it's not a Western, which is kind of where normally a setting in that time period would be. So then after that, I did write a Regency because Regency was, I had read tons of it. Like I used to read so much historical romance and kind of fell in love with it. I actually don't read that much historical romance anymore now that I'm writing it all the time, but that's what I always read. And then kind of fell into some Regency. And then at one point, I wrote a time travel series back to medieval Scotland. Just sometimes I love writing Regency. I love the period and all of and as you write it, you just come sort of immersed in it and know the fashion and the events happening. And but sometimes it's just you have to write something totally different just for fun, just to kind of keep things
Yeah.
interesting.
So so you had been reading a lot of historical romance that then kind of got you and hooked into this. So who are some of the authors that specifically influenced your work?
I would say I feel like everyone read Julie Garwood, but that was who I like grew up reading. I've read all of her historical romance novels. And I think the one thing about her books that kind of inspired me was that like every book is so unique and different, and she didn't really stick to one particular time period. Like she's written kind of all different in all different times. So I would say like her work influenced me. I was the kid that would go to the library and just like take out as many books as I could take out and go home and read. So, any historical romance in the library I was reading, and probably younger than I should have been reading it. But yeah, I think so. I don't know, besides Julie Garwood, I think it was just like the whole genre that really influenced
Mhm.
how I wrote. Some people who really enjoy like traditional historical romance sometimes find fault with it, but I like all of my female characters. They're usually pretty strong, unconventional. Lots of time have a particular hobby or pastime or even occupation that would not have been widely accepted in the Regency. And sometimes I hear like, well, I don't know that they actually would have done that, but I think, it's a matter of finding to make sure it's plausible that or it was possible. And that's to me just kind of something that I really enjoy writing and I really enjoy reading. And but I do always research and make sure that like, there were women like that. They just weren't maybe the norm, but they're also the ones that I find it most fun to read and write about. So yeah. So
Yeah, so where does research fit into your creative process? Are you like constantly researching or are you doing it to spot check stuff?
both. I'm kind of in between a plotter and a pantser, like I don't plot, scene by scene, but I usually have an idea of where I'm starting and where I'm going. So lots of times, depending on the book, some of the research is up front and then some during. Like if I know I'm writing, like one book I wrote was about a female banker, so a woman who had taken over a bank. And it's actually, I read a whole book before I started, like a nonfiction book before I started on women who were bankers in that time period. And it was
Hmm.
fascinating, like who these women's lives. And so that was, some upfront research that inspired the character in the book, but then lots of fact checking throughout, of course. So it's a little bit of both, kind of probably more research ahead of the book on, if it's a particular topic that I haven't written about before, and then the rest sort of during. So I guess kind of the original research is more of like inspiration as well, and then kind of the fact checking, or it's, well, with historical, of course, it's constant, like making sure they're in the right place and what that would have looked like and what street they're going down,
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
that fun stuff that, are just little
Yeah,
details, but
that's really interesting. I haven't heard about women bankers and before we were allowed to have credit cards.
yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's fascinating.
Yeah. That own banks. And yeah, I didn't realize how interesting it would be till I started reading about some of them.